Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So last Thursday, we talked about export subsidies. Export subsidies, while used by developed countries, are primarily a focus of trade policy in developing countries. Nevertheless, a whole series of arguments have been made in the last 20 years about how to use trade policy in the more advanced countries. And these arguments generally come down to one of two situations. Either the externalities that are associated with high technology industries, or the issues associated with highly concentrated industries, global industries, in which case there may be monopoly profits or oligopolistic profits. So those are two of the things that we want to look at today. Again, so these are arguments that, as opposed to sort of the export subsidy stuff, are very different sort of focus, and again, mostly made in the context of developing countries. So we've argued before that in order for from an economic perspective, national economic perspective, in order to justify some sort of government trade policy, we also need to have some sort of market failure. Presumably it's a domestic market failure that we're responding to. So that's what we need, regardless of whether we're looking at externalities in the high-tech industry or we are looking at monopoly profits. So those are the two issues that we want to pay attention to today. Now, when we look at the first of these, high technology industries, their exports and their externalities, that this is basically an argument that was led during the Clinton administration in the 1990s by Laura Tyson. Laura Tyson in the Clinton administration was the chair of the National Economic Council, which coordinated economic policy inside the administration. For those of you who don't know, Laura is also a professor at the Haas School of Business, where she was also dean at one point and left, and now she's back. And anyway, this is an argument that is primarily associated with work that she did in the late 80s and the early 90s. So the argument that she made was that within the context of the high-tech industry, there are a lot of positive externalities. And when we have positive externalities, then a case can be made for subsidizing the production of that industry. So we've done this before, but let me just come back to this real quickly and show you what we're talking about here. So on the left-hand side, we just have our standard supply and demand diagrams. Notice that in this particular case, rather than what we looked at before, where it was generally from the import side and arguing that we had marginal external benefits, now we have a country that's an exporter. So within the export side, we've got our supply demand curves, world price above our autarky price, so domestic quantity supplied is greater than the domestic quantity demanded. In our right-hand diagram here, we've put in a marginal external benefit curve. So when we get started, of course, just at free market prices, we would be sitting at S0 in terms of economic output. So if we can make a case, this is a big if, but if we can make a case that there are positive externalities in the high-tech industry, then we should be able to say, in order to capture those positive externalities, we should subsidize this industry. And by subsidizing the industry, we would see an increase in output of the industry from S0 to S1. Now there will be an increase in producer surplus, given by this area here, which most of the time seems to have a letter D associated with it. So let's just put D in. And that increase in economic output to S1 also needs to be put in our marginal external benefits diagram. And we end up, in this case, also being able to capture all of these external benefits that the industry is generating. So let's call this area G. Now we also have to take into consideration that the subsidy is not free, right? So for subsidizing the incremental production, it's the increase in the price times the increase in production. So the actual subsidy cost to the government is given by that square. So let's call this area E. So if we thought about what was happening here, we've got changes in producer surplus plus D, government revenue minus D minus E, and then marginal external benefits of plus G. Notice because this is a production subsidy, and assuming this was a small country just to keep the analysis simple, there would be no change in the world price. Therefore, there'd be no change in the price that consumers are faced with, so there would be no change in consumption. So we don't have to worry about any changes in consumer surplus. So our net effect on national economic welfare then would be minus E plus G. Now minus E in this case is our production distortion, and G is our incremental, marginal, or not incremental, but our marginal external benefit. So if we can argue that the marginal external benefit exceeds the production distortion, then this is something that the country might very well do. Notice that this does increase the amount of exports that the country is also undertaking. So this would be a way then of using a production subsidy would be one way of increasing production without having an influence on the consumption decisions. That would also expand our exports. Remember the whole idea is to push exports here. And we can also show that it's beneficial to the country as long as our marginal external benefits are greater than our production distortion. So as long as that's true, we've got a real good case to make here for this type of behavior or this type of policy. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, where are the externalities in the high-tech business, and how big are they, right? It still depends on how big G is relative to E, area E. So one of the things that we know about the high-tech industry, or at least the argument that's been made about the high-tech industry, is that high-tech firms spend a lot of money on research and development. And in fact, in some high-tech firms, the spending on research and development, at least if you believe the balance sheet and income statements, is as high as 50% of revenues. So you've got tremendous amount of spending in terms of research and development. Now remember, the research and development goes in a lot of different areas. Some of it is new product development, right? Got to come up with that next I something, right? So I just want to copyright the name. I don't need to come up with the idea, right? If you copyrighted iPad before Apple thought of the idea or the word, then they'd pay you something for it, I figure. Anyway, so some of it's coming up with new products, right? But a lot of research and development is also coming up with new processes, coming up with different ways of doing things or making things. And so that's also really important in terms of this research and development effort. Now, the other thing that also happens is that firms are also willing to take initial losses on new products or processes in order to gain experience. So notice that we could make an argument then that this sounds like dynamic learning curves. Now, here's the issue for high-tech firms in general, or at least the argument that was being made at the time. Within the high-tech industry, you have a lot of research and development. Let's just focus on the research and development issue for a minute. Have a lot of research and development going on. You're going to come out with a new product, new process. It doesn't really matter. And you've got it, right? You've come up with a new chip or a new way of making chips or a new consumer product. How fast does it take the other high-tech firms in the industry to basically copy what you've done? Right? Generally, it doesn't take very long, right? It's pretty easy to actually do. You go out and you buy an iPad, you take it apart, you reverse engineer it, you figure out exactly how it works. Right? Now, an iPad, we haven't seen a lot of knockoffs yet, but it actually turns out that an iPad is nothing but a Kindle reader and an iPhone put together. So the whole idea was off the Kindle e-readers. So it's really easy to sort of copy what somebody else has done without having to spend a huge amount of research and development efforts. So if you're the initial firm and you're saying, I'm going to spend all this money to do research and development to come up with this new process, but my competitors are going to come in very quickly, copy something that I've done, give me lots of competition, and while I might be able to earn monopoly profits or something that looks like monopoly profits early on because I'm the only producer, as time goes on, those monopoly profits are going to be competed away. So if I cannot earn excess profits on all this to recoup all my research and development effort, what happens? Some of my research and development effort is being done to the benefit of other companies, right? Other companies are able to appropriate the research and development effort that you have undertaken. So if I cannot get the full value of my research and development effort, it suggests that I am going to undertake less research and development than I would if I could fully appropriate that. If my profits are going to be lower, I'm going to do less of that activity than if my profits were going to be higher. So the inability to fully appropriate the gains from your research and development effort means that you undertake less R&D activity. But we know that research and development effort is very, very important in a lot of high-tech industries, as well as other industries like pharmaceuticals and biotech and so on and so forth. And we also know that companies are willing to start products, right, new products or new processes, in a way where they can absorb losses early on to gain that generally a production experience. So we know from our dynamic learning curves of earlier that what should happen is our average cost curve should be coming down. Well, what if it's a process that your competitors can copy? Why don't I let you, the initial firm who's come up with the idea, figure out how to do these kinds of processes, and I'll sit here and I'll just start taking notes. And then when you've got it pretty well perfected and you've absorbed all the costs associated with doing that, I'm now going to jump into the production process. Now, sometimes we have copyright rules or patents or things like that make that a little bit more difficult, but not always. So again, the original arguments were made in terms of the high-tech industry because both of these types of activities were being observed. Very large R&D budgets where the results could be appropriated by other firms, and also production processes that were very expensive to set up in the beginning, but brought costs down very quickly with a bit of experience that could also be appropriated by other firms not engaged in the same cost structure. So these were the areas in which the argument was initially made. So we know then that in either one of these cases, we would have too little of these types of activities going on. Positive externalities, individual firms will not undertake them. So again, we can ask ourselves, okay, we want to put a production subsidy in place to actually get to where we want to be. So then the question becomes, will the policy target the right thing? And then second is, do we have any idea how big these marginal external benefits actually are? So for the first of these is, we talked earlier about something called the specificity principle. When you have an issue, you want to target the government policy as directly as you can. So our argument on research and development efforts would say, okay, we want to subsidize research and development efforts only at high-tech firms? Well, then we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we actually define a high-tech firm? Most of us would probably not think of Walmart as a high-tech firm. But Walmart's adoption of computers and telecommunications advances through the 90s is really what made Walmart the behemoth that it is today. It has absolutely the most efficient distribution mechanism of any significant retail chain in the country. And they did it by adopting high technology, both in terms of processing information, but also in communicating it. So is Walmart a high-tech firm? And so you always run into this issue of, okay, we want to target a certain type of activity, but can we define the activity closely enough that it actually will impact what we want to impact? Second issue that we might ask ourselves about is all research and development efforts that are done at high-tech firms, assuming we can define what they are all the research and development efforts suffer from problems of appropriability? Or do all research and development efforts at high-tech firms actually have marginal external benefits? So Google, I think almost everybody would agree that Google is a high-tech firm, but Google has in-house kitchens and chefs who experiment with different recipes, which could be classified as research and development, Right? I got to research a new recipe. I got to figure out how to develop the recipe. Is that something that we should be subsidizing? Remember, these subsidies come out of tax payments, so we all get to pay for it. And of course, I think in that particular example, you can probably figure out the marginal external benefit is not terribly great. But how do you define a government policy that's going to subsidize certain types of firms, but not other types of firms, certain types of activities, research and development efforts within a firm, but not other types of research and development efforts within the same firm? How do you make those kinds of choices? And what do you do about the research and development efforts that take place in what are clearly not high-tech firms? All those firms have, many firms have research and development efforts. And so, again, where do we draw the line? And then, of course, you have the implementation and oversight issue. If you are going to subsidize research and development, will those firms who do research and development decide to put more of their current expenses in their R&D budget, which doesn't necessarily increase their research and development efforts? By the way, we see this all the time in universities. How do we allocate the cost of research grants, right? Well, you need a part-time person here and another part-time person here. If you're now going to give me a tax credit, can I make an argument for pulling those two part-time people in so I now have two full-time people covered under that rubric? So you have all sorts of issues here that can be very, very difficult to resolve. Now, it does turn out we do subsidize research and development, and it is not targeted very specifically. It will apply to all firms and into a wide range of research and development efforts. Again, it's very difficult to answer some of the questions that we have associated with how we end up setting, or how we set up these kinds of issues. Then the next question, of course, is just how important are those external benefits? Remember, part of the problem with external benefits is there's no market price associated with it. And so if there's no market price, we might see the change in the quantity produced, S0 to S1, but how do we know where that marginal external benefit curve actually is? How high is it? How low is it? We don't know. And notice, whether or not it raises national economic welfare or not depends critically on the size of that marginal external benefit. So we need to be able to measure some of these things, or at least have some sort of ballpark figure before we can actually make some good economic judgments about their validity. Now, it may turn out that our problems of appropriability are not at the level of the firm. That is, it's not that we have one firm in an industry where other firms in the same industry get to kind of ride on their coattails. Rather, the problem of appropriability may be at the level of the country or the nation. In fact, this occurs all the time, right? So you have research and development efforts or high-tech products that are developed in one part of the world that quickly get copied elsewhere in the world without having the expense of doing the research and development. So now, what you would see if you were to subsidize that is that the incremental output, the production distortion, and the subsidies would be domestic, but the marginal external benefits would actually accrue outside the country. So if we were looking at our national economic welfare, then, of course, we wouldn't want to include marginal external benefits that accrue to the rest of the world. Unless, of course, we're particularly magnanimous, which, of course, I'm sure we are. Okay, so let's take a second issue here. So rather than make an argument based on high-tech industries and externalities and those types of issues, we want to take a case where we have globally concentrated industries, where we have a high degree of imperfect competition. Now, I know we've talked about monopolies, we've talked about internal economies of scale, but here we're really talking about something a little different. We're still going to be talking about subsidies, but here we want to see is, can that subsidy be used in a way that we can create what we will refer to as a strategic advantage over foreign competitors? Notice that in the argument that we just made for high-tech industries, we weren't assuming necessarily that what we were going to win, the marginal external benefit, was at the expense of foreign competitors. But here, it might very well be. We've got competition on a global basis in a highly concentrated industry. And so in this particular example, what we're really competing over is the profits. So we've got imperfect competition. So there will be excess returns. And now it's just a matter of competition over those excess returns. So there are a lot of very complicated models in this regard. We're going to keep it simple, and we're going to only look at the case of a duopoly. So a duopoly is an industry with only two firms. Fortunately, there are such things. And what we'll see is imperfect competition, of course, is a market failure. So what we need to look at is how a government policy can influence that outcome. So probably the best example of global duopoly is the medium and large commercial aircraft industry in the world. Right? There are essentially two producers. There's Airbus in Europe and there's Boeing in the United States. And Russia and Brazil and China and Canada are all talking about entering the market. But so far, at least for this class of airplanes, large commercial aircraft, these are the two primary competitors. We'll assume that both are profit maximizing firms. So decisions will be made on the basis of profit maximization. We'll assume that there's only one good, a new jumbo jet, to be sold throughout the world. We'll assume that there are also economies of scale in producing new airplanes. Now, we can think about this as either dynamic learning curves, where as we gain production experience, the cost comes down, or as we increase the volume of production, the average costs come down.